The American Revolution War, also known as the American War of Independence, was a long conflict that spanned more than 8 years of fighting between Great Britain and 13 of its North American colonies. We'll go ahead with this chapter, Growth of Nationalism. In this we will learn about American Revolution first, and we are going to cover meaning of revolution, the American Revolution, and causes of the American Revolution. So what do you think? What is revolution? Revolution is the violent removal of the leadership or government of a country. At the last quarter of the 18th century is called the Age of Revolutions, where two revolutions has taken place, the American Revolution and French Revolution. The 18th century witnessed two revolutions that had a powerful impact across the world, the American Revolution and French Revolution, as I said before. The American Revolution was the first determined struggle against colonialism, which finally resulted in the formation of the United States of America. The revolution inspired colonies the world over the fight against colonial oppressions. The two revolutions thus also laid the basis for another powerful movement, nationalism. Nationalism is the feeling of loyalty, love, and pride that the people have for their nation. It is also a belief in the importance and power of one's own country. The American and French revolutions were two of the earliest nationalist movements in history. The voices of Christopher Columbus and Amerigo Vespucci between the years 1492 and 1502 opened up their routes from Europe to America. This encouraged people from Europe to come and settle in the New World, and that New World was as North and South America was there, in the hope of better living and working conditions. New World was rich in resources, and the European nations vied with each other to establish colonies here. Between the 16th and 17th centuries, Britain established 13 colonies in North America. Over time, the colonized Americans began to resent the rule of British and started fighting for their independence. Their fight for freedom came to be known as the War of Independence or the American Revolution or American War of Independence. They were the first among the various British colonies around the world to fight too. Here we'll go ahead with the causes of the American Revolution. Britain had imposed strict restrictions and several new taxes on its North American colonies. The Americans wanted them removed. When the British refused to do so, the Americans revolted. Now we'll learn causes in detail. So first we'll go ahead with economic causes. The 13 colonies were under the control of British government. Though the government of Britain gave the freedom in managing their local affairs, it kept a tight control on their economic affairs. In economic matters, they were subject to the British mercantile policy, which was concerned with the welfare of the parent country. By the mid-18th century, the colonies had developed prosperous agricultural economies with expanding industries and thriving maritime trade. To cash in on this prosperity, the British government levied heavy taxes on the colonies. It placed many restrictions on their trade and commerce. These restrictions greatly hampered the economic development of the colonies. Moving further, trade restriction. 13 colonies enjoyed freedom in internal administration, but their trading, industrial, and economic activities were strictly controlled by Britain. According to the Navigation Act, only British vessels were allowed to enter a colonial port. Another act required the colonies to export certain goods to Britain alone. The people of the colonies started resenting these laws. Also, the British Empire was under heavy loss and debt after the 7 Years' War. That was in 1756 to 1763 between Britain and France. It wanted the colonies to partly bear the expenses of the war. This was resented by the colonies. Coming to the political causes, while the colonies had elected assembly, the governor was appointed by the British government. He was all-powerful and not answerable to the assembly. He was responsible for looking after the British interest in the colonies. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War in the Europe, Britain was in dire need of to ease the burden. It decided to tax the colonies. In 1765, the Stamp Act passed by the British Parliament made it compulsory to affix a stamp on every legal document. Here I'll explain you. The Stamp Act was a law passed which imposed a tax on all American colonists. It required them to pay a tax on every piece of printed paper they used. The Stamp Act required all legal documents, licenses, commercial contracts, newspapers, pamphlets, and playing cards to carry acts. The money collected by the Stamp Act was to be used to help pay the cost of the British soldiers who were in America protecting the frontier. Colonists boycotted British goods in order to get the Stamp Act repealed or cancelled. Stamp Act sent waves of resentment throughout the colonies. This was opposed by the colonists who argued that the British government had no right to tax the colonies since they had no representation in the British Parliament. They gave a call for no taxation without representation. This was the slogan of the time. This demand for the representation soon transformed into demand for complete independence from the British rule. They rejected the unjust and oppressive British policies and asserted their right to govern themselves. As there were many uprisings and the British government was forced to repeal or cancel the Stamp Act, the British Parliament then passed the Declaration Act in 1767 that asserted the right of the government to impose taxes on lead, glass, paint, tea, and few other articles that were imported into the colonies. The colonies rose in rebellion once again. In a war, philosophers and political thinkers play an important role. Same happened in the American War of Independence. The writings of philosophers such as Thomas Jefferson and Tom Paine, who aroused the colonies' desire to be free from the control of Britain. They were also inspired by writings of European philosophers like John Mills Harrington, who wrote out the need for liberty and equality. The idea expounded in their works helped shape the mind of the Americans, encouraging them to fight for liberty and independence. Here we'll go ahead with another cause, or we can say the immediate cause under that, Boston Tea Party. The British Prime Minister Lord North repealed all duties except the one on tea. The colonists, however, continued to protest and refused to unload tea off the ships coming in from Britain. In 1773, the government ordered a tea-laden ship coming from Britain to be unloaded at Boston. A group of Boston citizens, disguised as Native Americans, American Indians, or Red Indians, boarded the ship at night and threw the crates of tea into the sea. The event that finally sparked off the American War of Independence was the Boston Tea Party of 1773. On 16th December 1773, a group of colonists, disguised as I said before, Native Americans, destroyed an entire shipment of tea sent by the English East India Company. They boarded the British ships and threw the chest of tea or crates of tea into the Boston harbor. This act was in protest against the new taxes, including a tax on tea imposed on the colonies. The British government saw this as an act of open defiance and responded harshly. The tension of the Boston Tea Party led to the American War of Independence. With the Boston Tea Party, the colonists openly challenged the authority of the British government and their right to levy taxes. In 1774, the representatives from all colonies except Georgia met at a congress at Philadelphia. This came to be known as the First Congress. At this Congress, the representatives requested King George III of England to restore their rights. This was perceived as mutiny by King, who sent the British Army to suppress the rebellion. So things have not ended here. The Second Congress also appealed to the King not to impose taxes without their consent. The king regarded this as an act of rebellion and declared war in April 1775. With an open declaration of war by Britain, the colonists set up their own army at the Second Continental Congress in 1775 and chose George Washington as commander-in-chief of their forces. So, the representatives of the colonies met again in Philadelphia, and the Declaration of Independence was signed at the Third Congress on 4th July 1776. By this, the 13 colonies declared their independence from Britain and formed the United States of America. Thomas Jefferson, you can see on screen, was the author of the Declaration. It is stated that all human beings are created equal with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. The Declaration stated that the 13 colonies that were at war with the British considered themselves free and would form their own government. They would no longer be under the control of the British government. This marked the formal beginning of the American War of Independence, which lasted for 6 years. So here we'll go ahead with the result of the war, or can say birth of United States of America. The War of Independence formally came to an end with signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. Through the treaty, the British government accepted and recognized their independence, and the colonies came to be known as the United States of America. In 1789, the national government of the United States of America adopted a republican constitution, where the head of the state is democratically elected president, not a monarch. A written constitution was framed for the newly born state. George Washington was elected as the first president of the United States of America. Features of the American Constitution and the American form of government have inspired the constitution and governments of many nations that gained independence later. You can see the flag of the United States of America on my screen. The flag of the USA was first adopted in 1777. Today, the 50 white stars represent the number of states in the United States of America. The 13 red and white strips stand for the colonies that fought against the British.